Hello, everyone. My name is Rami Sarakbi, and I work for the Canadian Red Cross as part of the fundraising team. So I work as part of the customer experience unit, and I'll explain a little bit what that means later on in the presentation. And basically the purpose of this talk is to sort of walk you through an intervention that we introduced at the Canadian Red Cross in partnership with Donor Voice to help us retain our monthly donors. Specifically, we were looking at ways to retain monthly donors that were acquired through our face-to-face fundraising channel, so street canvassing and door-to-door, and also explain why we focus on that segment in particular. Okay, so what is customer experience, and why are we talking about customer experience when the topic is about fundraising and a donor audience? So in essence, we're adopting customer experience as a marketing discipline that is already well established, and we're taking those principles and applying them to our context at the Canadian Red Cross, specifically looking at donors. So simply put, customer experience, or also known as CX, it's the perception that a customer, or in our case a donor, has of a brand, and it's influenced by touch points over the constituent's life cycle. So ultimately, we aren't looking at touch points in isolation, but we're taking a holistic view of the donor's experience and focusing on the cumulative effect of touch points. So CX has three different layers, and I'll just briefly touch on each one. So there's the customer or the donor journey, and this is the pathway that a constituent takes with your brand from their perspective, from the first time they hear of you to basically all the touch points in between a purchase or a donation. And these touch points are basically all the typical ways that a donor would interact with your organization. So phone calls, emails, text messages, contact centers. And the third piece is looking at ecosystems, so the different environments, also known as channels that a constituent experiences during their customer experience with the brand. So key takeaways here, the donor is always at the center of the experience. So often during our work, we may come across findings that challenge the conventional wisdom in our organization, through getting insights from our donors. So I'd like to thank Kiki for providing the image there on the right, and I think perfectly sort of encapsulates the disconnect that there can sometimes be between sort of our perception and our donors' perception of a touch point or a journey. So the second key takeaway is that we are channel agnostic at our organization. So our role as the CX unit is to lead the implementation of CX initiatives without focus on specific channel, whether direct mail, major giving, etc. So no touch point ever occurs in isolation, as I mentioned. So as a customer experience unit, we look at the sum of touch points and how they influence the experience. So why does any of that matter? Essentially, looking at sort of differences in retention rates between the for-profit world and nonprofit world, we notice a pretty large gap. So generally speaking, in a for-profit context, retention is around 90%, but the average in the nonprofit world is closer to 40%. Why do we think that is? A couple of key points. Firstly, unregistered complaints. So, often if a donor has a bad experience with an organization, and there isn't an easy way for them to voice their issue and have it resolved, they're likely not going to try to go out of their way to let you know in the majority of cases. They'll probably just cancel the donation, start donating elsewhere. So in the same way, if you think of it, that if you had a bad experience at a restaurant, more often than not, you probably just won't say anything and just won't go back there again. Second reason for that gap is a lack of a proven donor commitment measure. So without a way to accurately gauge how committed the donor is to the organization from the start, it's often difficult to anticipate which donors are likely to cancel their donation early on, which ones are going to stick around for longer, and then makes it difficult for us to sort of intervene and figure out where we need to put our focus. And that brings me to the topic of this particular project. So the reason that we started focusing on our face-to-face monthly donors and how to improve retention there is essentially face-to-face campaigns had the highest rate of cancellation amongst all other categories of monthly donors, so online, telemarketing, et cetera. Add to that the relatively high cost of acquiring donors through face-to-face. This meant that if a donor canceled their donation early, we'd often be making a loss on that donor. In addition to that, the vast majority of our face-to-face acquisitions are made through a vendor with a smaller number of acquisitions coming from our in-house team. So this means that ensuring that we're getting quality acquisitions and that we're not paying for donors that are likely to cancel within a week. Maybe they were pressured to sign up because the campus wanted to meet a quota, or otherwise we're acquiring the type of donors that are likely to cancel. So that is key. And it's also important that we're ensuring that we have a mechanism to evaluate our canvassers and respond to any issues that may come up. So in December 2016, we partnered with Donor Voice to launch an acquisition survey for our face-to-face monthly donors. And through the survey, we were able to gain some key insights. So we were able to derive a commitment score based on asking the donor 3 loyalty questions. So this at the point of sign up. Basically, how do you feel about the Red Cross? Questions of that nature, and then those are scored and averaged, and they will give us a sense of a donor's commitment at the start. We also get feedback on their satisfaction with the face-to-face experience. Did they like the canvasser's approach? Were they happy with that interaction? And we also get a sense of their intention to stay as a monthly donor. So the main survey benefits were it enables our donor experience team to follow up with donors for any issues that they may raise through the survey. Also gives us that canvasser evaluation data that we can then take to our vendor or take to our in-house team as feedback. We have also found that the commitment score that we get from the survey also correlates with donor retention, which gives us early insight into the quality of the acquisitions, because we know that generally a higher commitment score correlates with higher retention. And the survey also includes open-ended feedback. So this allows us to solve sort of individual issues that donors might be raising through that open-ended feedback. So for example, donor might say, I need an easy way to verify that canvasser that just came to my door is actually from the Red Cross and not a scam. So we can respond by ensuring that canvassers are wearing their Red Cross vests and their IDs are clearly showing. If a donor says, "Don't send me mail," we can respond by removing the donor from the mailing list before it becomes an issue. If a donor complains that the process is too long, we can follow up with the agency and try to find ways to make the process faster. Or if the donor has positive feedback as well, we can take that back to the canvasser and congratulate them on a job well done. The open-ended comments also give us, we can compile them together to get an overview of how well we're doing and which areas we need to focus on to improve. So another benefit to the survey is that we're able to pick up key insights. For example, we've noticed that there's a notable month-over-month retention lift for donors who completed the survey versus those who didn't. So it seems to suggest that those who completed the survey just by completing it seem to be more likely to stick around as monthly donors. Another key point is that the donor commitment scores that we're calculating based on the survey that's captured at the point of sign up could also help us predict month-over-month retention. So the more highly committed the donor is, the more likely we are to retain them. So just by introducing the survey, we've seen a few ways in which we're able to sort of predict retention and resolve issues before they may lead to a cancellation. Now, taking this a step further, we partnered with Donor Voice to put together a model that would help us to predict which segment is likely to be at risk of cancellation. So this model is developed by Donor Voice and was based on 30 predictive variables, including things like demographic information, age, gender, and then some of the key inputs from the survey, like commitment score and the donor's intention to stay. So all this was put together into a model with the goal of predicting which donors are likely to quit within the first 3 months. And Donor Voice basically would send us a weekly file containing those donors identified to be at risk. So taking this as an opportunity, we work to test the model and to see if we can introduce some sort of intervention that would help us save these donors from canceling. And essentially what the intervention that we tested looked like was a phone call. So we split the at-risk donor file into test and control. And we introduced the intervention to the test group to see if it had any impact on the retention. So the intervention was a phone call follow-up from one of our donor experience agents using a script that was developed with Donor Voice based on behavioral science. And the way that the calls would generally go is that the donor's feedback on the survey is used by the agent as kind of a starting point for a discussion. Or if the donor hadn't provided any feedback, the agent would ask them about their experience. And if the donor is dissatisfied, the agent will then discuss any issues that they may be having and offer solutions if possible. And then the final step is that the agent would confirm whether the donor felt comfortable with their choice to support the Red Cross. And if they weren't comfortable, the agent offers them a chance to potentially change their contribution. With the idea that maybe if the person was pressured into donating a higher amount at the door with the canvasser and intended to cancel early on because of that, we'd rather they lowered their contribution and then retain them as donors by doing that. So after testing for about 6 months, early results were very positive. So overall, we saw a very good lift in 3-month retention for the test group compared to the control group. And as you can see here, when we sort of broke it down into donors acquired through the external agency versus donors acquired through our in-house team, we noticed increase in retention in both, but particularly for the in-house team, we saw a major jump there. So it was a small sample, but it was a proof of concept for us to keep going. So what are the next steps for us from here? So seeing as the intervention proved to be particularly successful with in-house acquisitions, we're looking to basically focus our safe call efforts on that group in particular, which typically had lower retention rates to start with. Try to maximize our return on those calls. And we're also looking to maybe test different interventions. So try to phone call, maybe email, text, or sort of play around with that a little bit to see if it has an impact. Of course, DonorVoice will continue to test and develop the at-risk model to improve the accuracy. And with this proving successful, we can also look at expanding these kinds of interventions and this kind of at-risk modeling to other donor segments as well. All right, so that is it on my end.
Thank you, Rami.
Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Please feel free to submit any questions you have. Nick, do we have any questions already?
Sure, we have one so far. How do you determine commitment score? Do you ask them, and is it based off of certain factors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's basically 3 loyalty questions. Can't think of them off the top of my head, but there's 3 questions that I believe they were designed with DonorVoice. So there is some sort of rationale behind how those lead to commitment, and they're scored, I believe, out of 5, and then we average them to come up with a commitment score that we then apply.
That's exactly right, and they're on a 0 to 10 scale. They're things that are very easy for a person to answer, and it's I'm a committed donor to blank. I feel a sense of loyalty to blank, and blank is my favorite charitable organization. Are the 3 questions. We average those to get the overall commitment score, and it's those 3 questions because we put together years of research to validate that they do predict things like retention. Sorry for butting in.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Then we have a question saying, you talk about your criteria for identifying at-risk donors. What did you specifically identify as those criteria? So in the model, what were you seeing as things that jumped out?
That's a great question, and I'll probably have to pass that back to Nick as well, because I know there's a lot of different variables that went into it and a lot of data science that is way over my head. So Nick, are you able to speak to that?
I can speak to it in broad terms. What we do with the retention modeling is specific to each organization. So each organization has its own model. So I can't speak specifically to what Canadian Red Cross's factors are. But there's a mix of 3 different types of variables that go in. So there are demographic variables that go in. man or woman, age range, those sorts of things. And this is where a lot, so that's number one. Number two is transactional. What was their average gift? When did they make it? Were they a previous giver before that? Those sorts of things. And those two are things that are often in most retention modeling. The thing that is kind of the special sauce in this is the third section of questions, which is these questions about the experience, the commitment questions, satisfaction with the experience, those sorts of things that the donor can tell you and that you can really only get from the donor. And so that increases the predictiveness from just a traditional face-to-face where it's you say, I want to get people over the age of X because they're more likely to retain. That's absolutely true. That loads into the model. But there are other factors that go in for each organization. By and large, we see that older donors tend to do better than younger ones. We tend to see that people with more moderate average gifts tend to do better than the extreme outliers to either side. And it will not surprise you at all that some of the most predictive ones are if you're dissatisfied with the experience and it's not fixed, you are extremely unlikely to continue. Whereas if you're satisfied, you are far more likely to continue.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, there are like over 40 variables that go into the model. And just like Nick said, these include some of the standard variables that you would also look at, the demographics, age, gender, and amount. And from the other factors, the additional insight, supporter insight, the satisfaction with the experience predicts short-term retention, like right after, which makes sense. When you're not satisfied with something, you leave it or you cancel it immediately. And commitment to the organization predicts longer term retention, like up to 9 months, which again, it makes kind of sense. It's how loyal you feel to that organization, and that determines whether you stick around.
So we have a question coming in. Since interest might increase or decrease with more engagement with the organization, does it make sense to measure the interest scores periodically and not just at the beginning?
The idea is that as
sorry, go ahead.
commitment scores increase, so will donations and behavior. So you will be able to track that through what people are doing. So you don't need to go back and ask the same questions again.
Mm-hmm.
Rami, did you want to add something else?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
And then we have a question, Rami, specific to face-to-face acquisition. At what point would you encourage it as a strategy, and at what point would you not encourage it as a strategy?
Sorry, which specifically?
A question about face-to-face acquisition, generally speaking.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So generally speaking, like I mentioned, there are some I guess challenges with face-to-face. Part of it being, monitoring sort of canvasser or evaluating canvasser activity is incredibly important because it's representation of the organization, and sometimes with certain incentives to meet quotas, you can kind of lead to canvassers maybe taking some shortcuts in order to get that donor, and then that we end up paying for that acquisition, but that donor likely intends to cancel. Maybe they're just trying to get rid of the canvasser and that sort of thing. So as long as you have sort of the right controls around that, like we tried to do here with the survey and evaluating that data, it is actually a very effective strategy to use face-to-face. Often just being at somebody's door or speaking to them on the street, having somebody who's very passionate about the organization speak to somebody directly about it. We do see a lot of comments in the survey, people saying things like, I never considered donating to the Red Cross, so I didn't know much about you, but it's just the enthusiasm of speaking to that canvasser made me want to give. So there are very positive experiences that come from that face-to-face model, just keeping in mind some of those limitations as well.